Hello. We recently at our church completed a Sunday evening series of different sermons, and a lot of them have had to do with things about stuff that's going to happen in the future. And whenever I got to the passage about the new heavens and the new earth, kind of at the end of the Bible in Revelation 21 and 22, one phrase really stood out to me, and that is seeing the face of God, and really kind of what that meant. Let's look at it from Revelation 22. In Revelation 22 verses 1 through 5. Now, for the most part, like the first time that I read it, I just kind of, I read it like we always do, right? I mean, it's nice and everything, but let's take a look at it. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be no more night. They will not need the light of the lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. Like I said, first time I read it, I just kind of read it like I always do. It's nice what is being talked about here. It's great in verse 4. Look, they will see his face. So we've got this promise about being able to see God's face. And that is nice, okay? It truly is. However, there is more to seeing God's face. Let's back up a couple of chapters and see what else Revelation has about the face of God. This passage here is what we oftentimes call the great white throne judgment scene, and you'll see that from verse 11. But I also want you to notice what I've got here in underlined and in bold. It talks about the presence of God. Like literally, that would be his face. So it's not just his presence, but his face. Listen to it within its context. Revelation 20, verse 11 and 12. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were open. Another book was open, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what had been done as recorded in the books. Okay, so at this great white throne judgment scene, we see that from the presence of the one who sits on the throne, from his face, whenever his face is shown, the earth and the heavens, they fled. They flee at this point, and there's no hope, there's no place for them. Well, that's why in Revelation 20 you see that they flee from the face of God. But yet that's why at the end of the Bible we see there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth which can withstand the face of God. And we will one day be able to stand seeing the face of God. Now, in this lesson, the main thing that I want us to see is the idea of the holiness of God. Because we can easily, in our New Testament times of living, we can look at this and we can say, oh, well, seeing God face to face, that's wonderful, and it is. However, we need to respect the sacrifice that was given so that we can be able to see God face to face one day. Now, throughout the pages of the Old Testament, there is hope about being able to see God's face. Take a look at this with me. All the way back in Genesis chapter 3. Now, this is technically after Adam and Eve had already sinned, but notice that it says that they heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden. Okay, and then they hide from him. Yeah, well, that didn't go so well for them. But anyways, notice, could you imagine being able to be with God like this? I mean, it would be so amazing. And remember, it is possible someday. That's what Revelation 22 is all about, right? In the new heavens and the new earth, whenever everything is made new, we see that we can have the hope about being able to see the face of God. Now, in the Old Testament, though, this is just, a hope that is talked about. In fact, there are several passages about the hope of seeing God face and the hope of this relationship being mended at some point that was messed up all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. But there's this hope. Let's take a look at a couple of Psalms together. In Psalm 17, the psalmist right here, he talks about, I will be vindicated and will see your face. So in Psalm 17, the psalmist talks about that. Now, notice he also talks in the next line about after he was, awake and stuff. So, it's kind of interesting that Perhaps he's talking about, after death and everything, but we won't get into all those details about it. But he has this idea and this hope about being able to see the face of God. That hope is there. We see another psalm in Psalm 140. This time he talks about being in the presence of God. So now let's take a look, not so much at like a poetic telling about being in the face of God or in the presence of God or something like that. Let's look at a story about Moses. And this story about Moses is going to teach us something about seeing God's face. So let's look at it together. All the way back in Exodus chapter 33. Now, this story is recorded right after the golden calf incident. And Moses, he had some questions. I mean, mostly he wanted some assurance about what's going on and what is the Lord going to be doing, and what type of guidance has the Lord been giving up to this point. This passage right here, pay attention, because it will teach us about God's holiness if we choose to see it. Let's see it together. Exodus 33, beginning in verse 12. Moses said to the Lord, "You have been telling me, 'Lead these people,' but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, 'I know you by name, and you have found favor with me.' If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways so that I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." The Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Interesting, right? My presence. Notice that the presence of God is connected with kind of the face of God and everything. So you're going to see several phrases that are more or less kind of connected and used interchangeably in this passage. But the Lord, his reply is, look, my presence is going to go with you. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to give you rest. That's what he says in these times. But keep reading, though, because this story gets very interesting in a moment. Now continue on in verse 15. Then Moses said to him, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing that you have asked, because I am pleased with you and I know you by name." Then Moses said, "Now show me your glory." Okay, so right here, there's kind of this equating the presence of God with the glory of God as well. I mean, kind of, maybe not exactly, but whatever the case, these are a couple of different words that are going to be described as the same thing. But Moses definitely wants the people of Israel to be set apart. And he says, how are people going to know that we're any different? How are people going to know that we're pleasing to God if God isn't with us? And he says these things to the Lord himself. So now this comes down to, can the Lord even be in the presence of the people? Now, that's a big theme in the book of Exodus. Remember, that's the whole purpose behind the tabernacle. It was so that the Lord would be able to dwell with his people. And now they're kind of having this conversation about, how is the Lord going to be able to dwell with his people? And here Moses says, look, now show me your glory. He wants to see the glory of God. The conversation continues now. Verses 19 now and following. And the Lord said, "I will cause my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." Then the Lord said, "There is a place near here, near me, where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." Okay, so now we kind of see a few different phrases are used interchangeably, right? So you've got the presence, the glory, the goodness, and if you even kind of want to look at this in verse 19, we also see the mercy of God, the compassion of God is all kind of connected, but ultimately it comes down to verse 20. He says, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." You cannot see the face of the Lord. This has everything to do with him being holy, him being so powerful and so mighty. We as human beings cannot stand to just we cannot stand to be in the presence of the unfiltered glory of God, so to speak. In fact, the way that he filters it in this case, the way that God kind of filters his holiness, is he allows Moses to be like in a cave, if you will. And then as he passes by, he covers so that Moses can't see his face. and then he can only see his backside. It's kind of an interesting thing. He can only see him as he leaves. So he kind of got to see him, but not exactly gets to see him. He can't really see his face because you cannot see the face of God and still live. The holiness of God would just, he is so pure, he is so holy, it would just hurt us. I mean, it would kill us. We can't do that. We cannot see the direct holiness of God. Now, you might be wondering, so keep this story, in your mind as we look at this, because the question you might be having at this point is, do things change in the New Testament? Well, let's take a look at some statements in the New Testament. For starters, I'm reminded of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, verse 8. One of those blessings that he pronounces. He said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." You definitely still see that hope. Just like you had in the Old Testament about being able to see God, you definitely still have that hope in the New Testament. But is there more? Well, yes, of course. In John's gospel, I love how he begins it. In John chapter 1, verse 18, he's going to, restate kind of the same thing that we've seen before. Verse 18, John says, "No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." Okay, so no one has ever seen God. We've already kind of established that because you can't see God, right? But then he turns his attention to Jesus and he says, "But the one and only Son." He talks about this one and only Son. Then he even describes about this one and only Son being Jesus himself, of course, is God. See, Jesus has made the Father known to us. I've said it before, and I'm going to continue to say it many times following, I'm sure, that if you want to know how God would respond to a certain situation, fill in the blank of what that is, then look at Jesus. Because really, throughout the Gospels, you could probably find a situation that's very similar to whatever you want to know about how God would respond in this given situation. And Jesus was there. Jesus was in almost any type of given situation. Notice how he responded. Because, yeah, no one has ever seen God, but Jesus is himself God, and he is this one and only Son, and he has made him known to us. Now, this is not exactly how John starts his gospel. Obviously, we're in verse 18. If you look at verse 1, though, you get even kind of more details about this. In John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then verse 14, and just in case you're wondering, who is that word that's being described at the beginning? Why is this word being used right here? Verse 14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Notice, this Word, who was God, who is God, who always will be God, became flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. It's very fitting for this time of year, right? We always talk about that baby that's in the manger. Well, this is being able to see kind of the face of God, for God to be among us. And we, as humans, have seen his glory. We've seen his presence. We've experienced Jesus in a very wonderful way. In Jesus, we see the Father. That's why Jesus, many chapters later in John, will make this statement in John chapter 14. Now, John chapter 14 has already been this passage where he talks about going to prepare a place for them. And then he's already talked about that. We've kind of looked at some of that. But look at verse 6 through 8 with me. Jesus answered, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him." Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." See, Philip has this desire to just see the Father. He says, just show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Jesus has already been telling them all throughout right here that he is the way, he's the truth, he's the life. The only way to get to the Father is through Jesus. That's true for us as well. The only way for us to be able to have that hope of Revelation 22, being able to see the face of God, the only way that we can come to the Father is through Jesus Christ. So we can kind of say, sort of like Philip, right? Lord, show us the Father. Because Philip wanted to see the Father. But notice how Jesus responds to that. He says the same thing he's been saying before. Verses 9 and 10, Jesus answered, "Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you such a long time. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me?" That's Jesus' message always, that anyone who has seen Jesus has seen the Father. So, do you want to see the face of God? Then look to Jesus. Or I want us to look at one more passage together. And this is as the Apostle Paul puts it. I love how he puts it in Colossians 1 because he talks about the beautiful nature of Jesus, why Jesus came here, what Jesus' purpose is, and also how powerful and important Jesus is to everything that we believe. In Colossians 1:15 through 20, he starts off, notice all this praise to Jesus. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. This passage, once again, talks about how the Son is the image of the invisible God. You want to know what God looks like? You want to know what the face of God looks like? Look to his Son, because his Son is this image, this exact representation, this exact image of God. Now, yes, it is true that even all the way back at the very beginning, mankind was made in the image of God. We still are in the image of God, yes, but Jesus is this perfect image of God. The Son is the image of the invisible God. We see in verse 19 that all the fullness of God dwells in Jesus. And his purpose in verse 20 is through him, through Jesus, to reconcile to himself all things. That means any of this broken relationship, remember how cool it was in Genesis 3 that they were able to hear the presence of God in the garden. And from that time on, we've kind of lost a little bit of being able to be with God, and we can't be in that holy presence of God. Through Jesus, he came to reconcile. He came to mend that relationship, to fix what is messed up, to fix what's broken. So this study about searching of the face of God and being able to see the face of God, it teaches us about his holiness. We cannot look upon the face of God or else we'll just die. It also teaches us his mercy, that we can one day see God. And I know that's so weird because you look at it and you think, well, can we not see God or can we see God? Yes, we can. Because Jesus, like verse 20, it has reconciled all things to himself. Now, the question that comes to you and to me is, are we willing today to allow our relationships with God to be made right today? Right here, right now. Because that's why Jesus came. That's what Jesus wanted to do. And he has already made peace through his blood that is shed on the cross. That's up to us to accept that. Do you accept the peace that Jesus offers to us? Because he offers that through his blood that was shed on the cross. Will you come to Jesus and follow him? Because if you come to Jesus today and follow him today, one day you can have that hope about and that promise in Revelation 22, being able to see God face to face, to be able to see that face of God once again, and for our relationships to be made whole. That's a beautiful promise. It's a wonderful promise, and it is offered to us who will follow Jesus today.